with this crowd, I'm assuming everybody's read Genesis before. Don't mean to assume, but I'm guessing everybody has right here. And hopefully a lot who are watching online or have hopped on and had a chance to read it. So you probably have a good guess that it's the first book of the Bible. And it's the first book of the first section of books in the Bible. Anyone know what that's called? That's an easy one. Everybody knows that, yeah. Pentateuch. It's the book of the law, the Torah, or the book of Moses, sometimes called. But the first 5 books. So to start it off, I wanted to make sure we had just a good biblical structure for anybody watching along, because we're hoping to go through as much of the Old Testament as we can, starting with Genesis. And we'll see how we run through it. So just wanted to touch a little bit on the structure of the Bible tonight, too, to get us going. And so I have some numbers up here written down. You might see them: 512, 55, 12, 41, 21, 1. Those aren't Social Security numbers or lotto numbers or anything like that. That's actually was one of the ways that I was shown for structuring the Bible. That's the structure of the Bible right there. The Old Testament on the top line and the New Testament on the bottom line. You might be able to guess some of it as well if you take a look and think about it. But it just goes 512, 5512. 512, 5512. That's the Old Testament. You can say it with me if you want. Ready? 512, 5512. Now, can anyone identify what all those are? Dave, you got it. Got that. Oh, yeah. You got it. Right there, yep. We start with the Pentateuch, the books of the law, the first 5, the Torah. They move on over into the history books, and then from the history books over to the wisdom literature, the major prophets, and then to the minor prophets. Just to be clear, especially mentioning the prophets, everybody do you know the difference between the major prophets and the minor prophets, why they're listed as such? Exactly. It's just how long they are. They're all equally important. The difference being that you could fit all 12 of those on one scroll. And so they put them in one book, the book of the prophet. And so what we call the minor prophets, simply because they fit on one book. Whereas, like, we go to the Pentateuch is really one story, one full story, but it couldn't fit on one scroll. It fits on 5 scrolls. So we have 5 books, or the Pentateuch, the 5 scrolls. And so that's why we're left with the 5 for this. But yeah, 512, 5512 is the structure of the Old Testament. Just as a quick, easy one to go. Can anybody name them all off in order? That's a fun one. I always get the minor prophets a little bit, which is why I have a little mnemonic device to get them. But Esther, I'm sure you can. You wanna give those to us so we know them? Huh? Yeah, I think so. I'm imagining most people here can do it. I'd love to have people who couldn't at some point to learn some of that or watching online. It's okay if you don't know them. It's perfectly fine. We can learn them and get them down. But we'll be going through those. Now, the 12 were always a little tricky for me in order, which is why I had to come up with a few things to sort of encourage me in those. I have it nowadays, but I won't give away my secrets right now. We can wait till we get to the minor prophets. And then this one, 4:1:21:1, that's probably maybe a little more obvious because there's less in there. So what's the breakdown there? Yep, got the 4 Gospels. Yep, the 1 history book. All the letters, yep. And Revelation, breakdown. Really, this is a breakdown of the genres. And this is sort of breakdown of the genre, only gets a little set. So here you have, the Old Testament is the law. You have the historical books are written as histories, the ones that are written as wisdom literature, and then the prophetic books there. And for the New Testament, we have, the Gospels. We have the actual gospel literature there. We have the 1 historical book, Acts, that tells a history of the church. We have the, the epistles, the letters that went out, and then the apocalyptic book, the 1 prophetic apocalyptic book of the New Testament, Revelation. So sort of the different genres and how they are written. The Gospels written to present the good news. Acts, the history to tell the story of the church. The epistles, the letters to give instructions to individuals and to churches. And then finally, the revelatory apocalypse. That's sort of 2 words, the same thing. But the revelation, the apocalypse, the revealing of things, the 1 prophetic book, solely prophetic book of the New Testament. So that's the outline of the Bible. And if you're looking at you can sort of break down into how the story of the Bible is told in different ways. I like breaking it down in a real simple way where you really get, you get the beginning, you get the middle, and you get the end, or moving towards the end, and then like a final after epilogue. One way you can break it down that I like breaking it down, and I should have left room to write this, is we start with the creation, where we get an introduction to God and who God is. Then we get the problem, which is the fall. That steps in, and we have an issue. And then the rest of the story then is God fixing it all the way to the millennium. And so, the midway point in that structure is Genesis 3. So Genesis 1 and 2 is the first half of the story. Genesis 3 is the middle, and the rest of the Bible is the second half of the story. So it might be a little weighted towards one side, but there's probably a good reason for that. But even when you get to the redemption story, we have different stages in it. We start after the fall. We start with this era of people just realizing how bad they are until God steps in, flood, destroys everything. Man starts rebuilding, has issues, and God finally calls out someone to follow him in Abraham. And so we have sort of this move towards a theocracy where God is the one in control of them. We know the story there. Most of us do. How well that goes for a while. And then finally, the people say, no, give us a king. So we enter a monarchy. And we enter a period where it's a kingdom that's still under the control of God, but no longer the theocracy that was, as they now have human leaders. And it works great, sort of, for like 1.5 reigns. And then it goes downhill for the next several centuries until we get to the exile. The exile finally settles it that, hey, you guys made the wrong choice, and they actually sort of get it then. And they don't ever struggle with the thing that they used to struggle with. They just find new things to struggle with. And so we go from the exile, and all the time after that, even after they return to the land, still not completely returning to God. And then we have Christ and the actual answer to everything that's been building up to over all those thousands of years. And then we have the redemption story come to its climax, and then the outpouring of that with the church, and eventually all the way to the millennium when Christ rules not just spiritually over his people, but literally over the world for 1,000 years, and then the eternal state beyond that. And so that's sort of the structure that the Bible is set up and sort of follows it going through the line there. But we pick it up tonight at the first half of the Bible, the first half of the story, picking up in Genesis 1. And so that's where we are today. I'll go ahead and read through it in just a moment so that we have that out. Again, I always like to actually have the word out there as we go through it. But tonight we're going to be hitting Genesis 1. Next week we'll jump into Genesis 2, which will be a little bit shorter, and then we'll go on from there. Genesis 3, 4, 5, so on and so forth, trying to, hit at least a chapter a week as we move through it. So Genesis begins. It's the good beginning. I'm going to read it here in the ESV, just so everybody can hear it. But if you want to follow along, it's not too long, so we should be able to get through it in good time. But here it is, Genesis chapter 1, beginning at verse 1 here, the creation of the world. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." And God made the expanse, separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse heaven. And there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seeds according to their own kind, trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be light in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, And let them be signs and for seasons and for days and years, and let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. God set them in the expanse of the heavens and to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures. Let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens. So God created the sea, creatures of every living creature that moves, and with which the waters swarm according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to their kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things, and the beasts of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the bird of the heaven, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And God said, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, there was morning, the sixth day. That's chapter 1 of Genesis. Beginning of the story. Has a very happy beginning there. Now, before we jump into that, I did want to make sure that I just addressed a couple things as we go in. The first is, as we go to the creation story, there obviously is a lot of debate in the Christian realm about what does this mean as far as in relation to history. Where's the truth in this? Is this a record of almost like a scientific observation of what's going on? Or is this allegorical story proclaiming that God is in control of all? Is this something that was written to a certain people at a certain time based on what they knew? What is the reading of Genesis 1? Oh, that's out there. It's one of those things that has developed. Normally we'll phrase it as, especially within Christian circles, what's called the young earth and the old earth debate. There's other debaters in that field, but they wouldn't necessarily consider themselves Christians or believers in the Word at all to begin with. But people who believe this is the Word of God fall into those two large camps. First thing that I do want to say, since I mentioned allegorical, as we read through First Genesis, my position, and what I hold to, is that this is a literal account of creation that happened over the course of 6 days. And that this happened sometime in what the framework of the young earth setup. And I've done, the research on both sides and read plenty of the articles and studies and whatnot, and I'll tell you what, nothing's convinced me otherwise. Unfortunately, there is vested interest in keeping some ideals afloat, and so you will do what you need to make one's work with evidence that is less than compelling. And unfortunately, I feel that old earth style often does that. Not that I could it myself. But that definitely happens there. That being said, as we come to the account of Genesis, we do need to realize one thing that I think is important, that it is a literal account, but it's also a literal account that's being told as a story to a people. And so while all these events happened exactly how they happened here, it's also good to know what was he writing into and what are some of those areas where it's so cool that Moses, by the inspiration of God, is sort of taking apart the bad theology that they've had, slowly detangling them from the centuries that they've had in these other people groups and the centuries of ideas that have been out there, trying to get back to what the truth is, as opposed to what sort of got perverted to over hundreds and hundreds of years of human ideas being added to the creation account. We'll get there in just a moment. But on to the young earth and old earth debate, I do want to say that this is not a salvation issue. If you believe Jesus Christ is your Savior, you believe that he came, died for you, that he is the Son of God and all that, you can believe that in some way, day-age theory or any other way, that God brought about creation. As long as you believe that he created it, it's not a salvation issue. But it is a question of how much, what category do we put things like this in, and how much are we willing to trust the literal reading of Scripture. There's times where it is allegory. There is times where it is poetic. But there's also times where it seems written a little too clearly to be taken any other way than this is what happened in the beginning. And so, not a salvation issue. But as I read it, I see just too many good arguments leaning on that young earth side, that the earth was created, I don't know, sometime in the last 10, 15,000 years, and that God brought it about in 6 days. And the evidence, as far as I've seen, can fit that pretty well. But I'm always happy to debate that with anybody here. I'm guessing not too much of a debate here, but if you guys want to, I'm always up for it. So anyway, just want to make sure we start from that. So we are reading Genesis as a literal account that occurred sometime between probably 10 or 15,000 years ago. And that's when God created the world, and he created it as it's written here within roughly 24-hour day segments. You can get into all the specifics of it, but you don't normally say day in this way unless you mean 24 hours. And certainly a day, we can say in Scripture that a day for the Lord is like 1,000 years, or 1,000 years is like a day. However, that wouldn't account for somebody who wants to expand that to, a billion years for that. Plus, a billion years would be a little tricky even if we try and say that. I mean, there's at least as much miracle God doing this in billion years days, how plants survive for a billion years without any sun. I'm not saying that God couldn't do it, but that does strike me as a little odd there, a little odd reading. But we'll get into this. So we start at the beginning. If you want an outline as far as I lay it out, it's pretty simple. Verse 1 is the beginning. Verse 1 simply lays out the beginning, how it is. Verse 2 presents the problem. There actually is a problem in Genesis 1 that is presented, because it's a problem that every other culture around the Hebrews dealt with. And they all dealt with it in the same way. God dealt with it in a very different way. And then, from verses 3 to 25, the third part there is the response that God has. How does God respond to that problem, at least as other cultures might have seen it? And it ends on the very end there, from 26 to 31, with the people. We have the beginning, the problem, the response, the people, sort of the breakdown as I see chapter 1. So we'll begin with that. Verse 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I did write the Hebrew up here because the Hebrew is so fun. This is a good one to if you want to know any Hebrew at all, this is a good place to start. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim va'et ha'eretz. That's in the beginning created God the heavens and the earth, ha'eretz. That's the Hebrew construction for it, and the way it's written out there. And it is really fun when you get into it. We have the beginning. This is literally the name for the book. Genesis means beginning, because that's the very first word is right here. Rashit. Rashit. Ba is a preposition in. So in or at the beginning, what happened? God, Elohim, created. That's the very beginning, the first little idea there. That in the beginning, God created. In the beginning, God created. Now this is it gets a little bit interesting here, even when we jump into what is going on with the beginning, because this automatically sets it against everything else that is being said at that time. This is being written in the what they call the ancient Near East, the ANE cultural context. In that context, there were a lot of creation stories. A lot of creation stories. And all the creation stories said this, that there was some primordial essence that deity-like creatures that were very human-like arose out, and then they fought wars, and then they built the universe out of the bodies of the dead gods. That was pretty much how they all wrote. Babylon had the story of Tiamat, the mother, we sometimes refer to her as mother of demons or mother of monsters, but this first creature thing, and she fights against her son Marduk, and they fight, and he kills her and makes the universe out of her. Okay, great. Similar story comes with the Egyptians, where they have the ideal of this primordial sea, and out of it rises gods that fight against each other, and the Supreme One makes the universe. And then beyond that, what is the other one? Oh, the Philistine one, Baal. We have Baal fight against Yam, and they do their battle, which is reenacted every year. But in this battle, Baal, defeats and sets up, and he creates the world out of, the ashes and destruction of his enemies. But here, what we get is simply, in the beginning, God created. There's no challenger for God. There's no one who stands against him. There's nothing he needs. All those other stories were saying that our gods needed something to make stuff. There's nothing. God just steps on the scene all by himself, and he creates. And I love this word, bara, here. This word is a little bit of an interesting word, because in the Old Testament, it is only used to speak God. It is only used to speak of God. There's some other Semitic uses of it that you can find, but bara is the word used when God is doing the creating. You go and look, it's used a whole ton of times in the Old Testament, but as you run through all of them, it's always God. Either God created it, so it's saying that God did the creation, or it's something that's being referenced as this is what God made. And so this, in the Old Testament, is a theological word. It is a word meaning that God did it. No one else. There was no one else that took part in it. The only one who had any part in it, the only one who has any claim to it, is God. And so we enter in a completely different story, a shocking story for anyone in that culture to hear. No, there wasn't some weird things going on. We didn't have strange family battles and fathers who wanted to kill their children and all of this stuff, which oddly looked a lot like the society in which they were being written. We don't have these man-like gods. We have a God who's above all, the one who created. Nothing else there. He created. So in the beginning, God created. Now I'll throw this one out here too, just because it's a fun one, going through the Hebrew. We have the word here. This is Elohim. So if I were to write it in English now, I got a Elohim. There we go, Elohim. Elohim, what's fun about this word is, you probably heard that word before, right? Speaking of God. There's a few words in the Old Testament to speak of God. Sometimes El, often Elohim. There's also, obviously, Yahweh, but that's not spoken by the Hebrews, and so they give it the vowels after the fact of Adonai. So you say Adonai, or Lord, and that's where we get our fancy all-caps Lord name. So we have the different names that are used to speak of God. Elohim is such an interesting one because it is speaking of one God, and yet the word, as you might know, is a plural word. Now, there's many attempts to explain why was it a plural word, because they knew it was one God. Why did they use a plural word to speak of one God? Now, one argument is that this is the plural majesty. We have something like that today, where the queen can come up and say, "We declare, so and so," using a plural, speaking of herself. Okay, I mean, they did have that back then, but they didn't use it like this. This is a pretty unique construction. Some also speak that it's the plural of grandeur. God is so great that a plural is used to speak of him. Now, I think those might have truth for people reading in the Old Testament who didn't have a full concept of the Trinity, but I like that with the greater revelation that we have been given, that we're able to look back and see, even since the beginning, God had these little bits in here just reminding everybody, hey, there's more to me than meets your eye right now. There's more to me than what's been revealed. and we find the triune God. And in fact, as you go through Genesis, you get more hints of that. And it's like, wait, what's going on here? And then you read John, and it's like, oh, it makes sense now by the time you get to the Gospel of John. But that's what we have here. Bereshit bara Elohim, and then et is just the direct object, and then the front, Shem, the heavens and the earth. That's where we start. And this is sort of a what we call, or this would be a really early introduction to Hebrew literature in their forms. When we get there, they have all these little poetic things that fill out everywhere. I mentioned them before, things like the chiastic patterns, where they go out and they go back in literally. Here's another one that we mentioned, and this is a merism, heavens and the earth. Try to think of two farthest way things to make sure we indicate he created everything. And so this is the introduction to the book. Just a quick, it covers it all. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He did everything. And then we take a step back in verse 2 to actually hear what's going on and how, a little more specifically, he created things. And that's where we get to verse 2, where the earth was without form and void. Darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the deep. I'm going to erase the Hebrew now, so I hope you got it written down if you wanted it. There it goes. By Hebrew. All right. So we're picking up with this verse 2. We get into verse 2, and we get the image of the sea. We get the image of the chaos here, the image of water. So one of the first lessons in ancient Near East culture, sea is always bad. They didn't like the sea. The sea represented the eternal chaos that most of the, in the different religions they had, the evil deities and things resided in the sea, or they were the gods of the sea. You didn't deal with the sea. Living in a culture like they did, the sea was a scary place. For them, that would have been the Mediterranean Sea, or the Great Sea, but you lost a lot of people out there. It wasn't a safe place. So they looked at it, and they saw, this is dangerous, this is scary, you stay away from it, and usually, like in the example of the Babylonians, their evil god that gets destroyed is the god of the sea, which was, in their case, Tiamat, which was the sea goddess representing the saltwater seas, I believe it was, and how, the beginning in there. So, God does things differently. The earth was form and void. Darkness was over the face of the deep. But was God concerned? Was he fighting some battle with evil out there? Well, not at all. He was cruising over it. Like, no big deal. And here we get one more little Trinitarian piece here. Because what was hovering over the sea? The Spirit of God. The Spirit of God was hovering over the sea. So we see the action now of the Holy Spirit. Veiled, but now we can actually see what's going on there. And it's not a battle. It's not dealing with God struggling in any way. There's no doubt in it. Like the story, again, going to the Babylonian story, no one knew who was going to win the battle. What was going to happen? No one's worried about it in Genesis. He created it all. He's in control of all of it. There's no chaos that he can't take over. There's no chaos that he's not in control over. So he can be over that formless, void earth, the still yet to be fashioned earth, without any concern and any problem. Now, I do need to mention, just because I have too much fun with theology, and we might run out of time before we get to verse 3, so I'm sorry about that. But you might have heard something called the gap theory. Has anyone heard of that before? Good, okay. So the gap theory says that chapter 1 isn't the introduction to Genesis, or a synopsis of Genesis, but verse 1, I'm sorry. Verse 1 is in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, is a complete creation story, and then something happened, which is where the gap comes in, the gap between verse 1 and verse 2, that the earth became formless and void, because that term there, the earth was, can sort of be taken as it became. So if you translate it that way, the earth became formless and void. Now, according to that theory, and I'll just lay it out there, God created the heavens and the earth, and he created everything, and in that, there was a whole population and all the stuff and whatnot, but something happened, some cataclysm happened that made it formless and void, and usually a Christian holding that position would see that as like the fall of Satan. That sort of brought about this great ruin in this primordial world, and that gap theory is often used to explain, evidence of old age and things, because it could have been a billion years ago, or 5 billion, or 10 billion, that all that gap stuff happened, how long things rested, form, and void, and then God sort of got back to his creative work. I love that as a thought just for the fun, sort of exciting fiction value of it. I'm not convinced of it just based on the simple reading of the text. Seems like that's, first off, an important thing to leave out. Like, the gap is only gaps there because there's a space between words like there should be. So it's not really convincing literarily. It's not convincing lexically. Like, the words don't quite match up with the gap theory. Now, I have friends who've held it, and good for them, and you can write some fun stories off of it, but it just doesn't convince me that any of that happened. Definitely, there was a battle in heaven before mankind got on the scene. And so we know that's there, but we're not given any real context for that. We're not given any context to that until we get a few little images, and that's because it doesn't involve us other than in Genesis 3. That's when it involves us, but we got to own our own stuff. We can't look back to some, prior civilization and say, well, they messed it all up for us. No, truth is, we had a choice, and we made the bad choice. So that's how things went. So that is gap theory. It's a very interesting one, but won't dwell on that very long. And so we move on from there. So God is there, hovering over the face of the waters. And then we get to, that presents a problem. The problem being that we have the overview, and we have the beginning, and it's still empty. So what's going to happen to this earth? This empty canvas of gods that he has, what is going to happen? Not much of a problem to have, but that's the problem presented, because in the ancient Near Eastern culture, that was the problem. That was a problem. That was the center of all problems, was that there was chaos, and we didn't know how the gods came about with an answer. God's thing is, well, yeah, he's lounging around, watching it all. He's going to fix it. Just give him a moment. And then it happens. In verse 3, God said, let there be light. And there was light. So we get the very first element of creation. Now I like, when you go to Hebrew, there's a few fun words. And in this case, we get a let's see if I can say it right, Yahi, I believe, Yahi for this, for let there be light, which, it's, for all the fancy stuff, it's called adjussive, and so it's sort of this permissive command to become into existence, but it's the word, in its core, is simply the word to be. In fact, you could take it back and make a case that Yahweh is a derivation of the form as he is who he is, the one who exists. And so when God speaks, what he says is, light exists, and it exists, and it's there. There's no work on God's part. There's no battle on God's part. Every other culture talks about this battle to bring about things. God simply says, light, be there, and it's there. Light exists. Out of his imagination, out of his mind, he comes up with the ideal of light, and then he makes it exist in the world. And I just think, man, what a beautiful image, how that begins. Now, it's a little fun as we get to this. There's no battle, but God's already won the victory. Because along the sea, another image is darkness. Darkness is evil and wrong and bad. Darkness is like the sea. It's the chaos. You don't know what's out there. And how does God fight the darkness? Well, he just makes light. That's what he does. He makes light, and light is there. Light fills the heavens. Light fills existence. Now, my scientific mind starts rolling like, well, what does that mean? There's no sun yet. There's no moon. There's no stars. Nothing to create light. So what's going on? And there's answers. Some people will say, like, oh, well, it's the glory of God, the radiance of God. My sciencey brain, I just think, oh, he created the electromagnetic spectrum. That's what he did. No source of it yet, but he created the spectrum, and it's there. Because when I hear light, that's what I think. And so in my mind, that's where it goes. Doesn't explain it anymore. So it's okay to think otherwise, or just see like radiance coming out of the Spirit of God who somehow is manifested within creation over earth. That's fine too. In my mind, I just see all these like waves and sine waves and things, and there it is. It's all out there. Electromagnetic spectrum exists. And I'm assuming along with that, all the forces of nature, as we call them, the weak force, strong force, gravity, and light, or electromagnetism, all of it just fills the universe. He has created physical laws. It's like, oh, that's right. Our God just imagined all the physical laws that rule the universe. They didn't exist. They're not like a priori things. They're not things that have you got to start with. He could have done whatever he wanted with physical laws, and the universe would have just had to work any way it did. But he chose this way so that, things fall. Yay, God. That was a fun one. He imagined it. He created it. And the universe exists, and now light exists. Light is there. The first victory over that darkness that's been in existence didn't bother him, but bothered all the other cultures. And then he created light. And God saw that it was light, and he separated the light from the darkness. So he said there's a difference. There's something that's light, and there's something that's dark. Now, how is it separated at that point? No idea, other than they exist. And so he created light, which creates a separation even by itself. He looks at it. He calls that light day. He calls it darkness night. There was evening, and there was morning, the very first day. And so that's the first day of creation. Light now exists. We begin to move into the second day then. Day 2, we have a different element to the story here coming in. Day 2, he begins to build first this expanse. And so God said, let there be an expanse. Some versions may say canopy or something like that. But he builds this space, this empty space that's supposed to separate some things. So he said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. So all of a sudden we have waters above and waters below and an expanse between. Now there's some wondering, okay, what exactly is that then? Why is there an expanse? What are the waters above and waters below? As a young earth creationist myself, easy answer is that there was a water canopy that was actually over the earth before the flood, and there was water above the expanse and below the expanse, and there was atmosphere between the two of them, which actually created the perfect circumstances that the early pre-deluge time, pre-diluvian time, so before the flood, that perfect earth light, what humans need perfectly to live, which is why they could live so long, experience life like they did, and live in a way that is simply not possible after the fall of that canopy and the rest of the degrading of the natural realm. Anyway, go a little too far on that. So there was that watery expanse. But what is really neat to see here is that God is the one setting the limits. He is beginning to set limits in the universe. He starts with light, and we see a little bit of that because he separates light and darkness. God sets limits. So now he sets a limit in the waters. He makes an expanse. He separates them. He is doing this. And how is he doing this? He is doing this by his word. He is saying, let there be. Expanse exist. Again, a shock to everybody reading this because they're used to, they have to cut up the corpse of Tiamat and then lay it out the right way to separate everything. And it's a bloody hard work, really difficult, and, they're really tired afterwards. God just said, let there be an expanse. There was an expanse. He just created the limits. God doesn't need permission to make limits. God doesn't need permission to make boundaries. He does it by his word, out of his imagination, and he does it. So he makes his expanse. He separates those waters. He calls the expanse to heaven, and there was evening, and there was morning the second day. I think we have enough time for one more. So we'll do the next day, and we can pick up the rest next week. So next day, we have yet another boundary that God begins to put into place. Now, with a mind for what's going to come on this planet that he is just having fun imagining and putting together. And so we have this. God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together in one place, and let dry land appear. He makes land. Again, this is amazing for somebody reading this within the culture, because chaos is supposed to be this extreme, the anti, like the anti-God thing. They're the anti-good deity thing. They're supposed to have to fight it. And God just, no, gather here. There's a line. You can't go any farther. That's where you're going to be. I'm just going to make it. And that's what God does. He sets boundaries. He separates them out. And we have sea. We have dry land. And God called the dry land earth, and the waters were gathered together. He called sea, and God saw that it was good. Victory over chaos. There's land. The water, that primordial water that the Spirit hovered over, is now constrained. It's in its area. And it was all done. So that God now can move on to building life and going on from there, which we get next here. And God said, let the earth sprout vegetation. So now he creates life. He first creates order out of chaos, and then he begins to create life. One of the good things as we read through Genesis is not only hearing the story for the accurate telling of creation that it is, also hearing it from trying to understand the point of view of those early readers and what they were hearing about the victory of God and how easy that victory of God is. But also, as we read it, we get an image of the heart of our God. And this is what he does. He takes chaos, and in his own work, he does it all himself, and he does it with no effort on his part. He sets boundaries and makes something out of the chaos. He brings order. And then he brings life. And that's what we have here. He brings life. And so all the vegetation sprouts, plants yielding seeds, fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to his kind, on the earth. And it was so. The earth then brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seeds according to their own kind, trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. I mean, how amazing is that? God, in his imagination, he created light because he imagined it. All the laws of the universe because he imagined it. The idea of dry land, a separation, so you'd have different realms of different life being able to thrive. And then he just comes up with all the plant life that exists right there off the top of his head. And he just creates it by his word. I mean, the millions of different types of vegetation that there can be, and all the ways they can intertwine and mix and create hybrids and whatnot, all of that in his mind, and he just brings it about. And he could have done all of this, every bit of this, in one instant. But it's almost like he drags it out just so that we can see how wonderful he is. He could do it like that. Everything's here and it's all fully done. Instead, it's like, first, let me do this. Now, guys, watch this. I'm going to do this. Then come here, watch this. Now this. And life. Isn't it amazing? We can just rejoice that our God's so creative, that our God is so powerful, able to do this, and brings forth life. And now we have a fully ordered world. We have life in this world, and we have an idea that he's doing more. And probably should leave it there because I'm 5 minutes over where I wanted to go. So we'll pick up on day 4 next week, and that should be good because we'll want to talk a little bit on that last section on the person. So we'll call it there. Any questions though on anything that we addressed or went over? Any thoughts? Yes. Point. Yeah. The story hasn't changed. Oh, yeah. I think the Egyptian myths are the best for that scene. Because in Egyptian myths, especially myths they were dealing at the time, there was an ever-existent water. And out of that water arose the first Egyptian god, and then from him developed all these other gods. The story, yeah, you're right. I mean, the story hasn't changed. They try and use the same story to try and write out God. Because in these people, it sounded a little bit more like our Genesis account because it was closer to that time. Because at the flood, at that point, everybody knew at least somewhat of the account. I'm sure some of it had probably been lost by the time of Noah, but he at least knew the basics of what was going on, if not knowing the whole story and was passing it down. So it was there, and for one short amount of time, the only time out of 2 times in the world that everyone shared the same belief, we have Adam and Eve. They all knew it. After that, who knows where Cain went, and then from there it just went crazy. But then you get back to Noah, and he knew the truth. So everyone on earth knew the truth. For just a short amount of time, they spread out, and it got perverted again. That's what sin does. It takes that and adds all these things. It humanizes it. It says, no, we can't have God who's so powerful that he can just create matter because we're humans and we can't do it, and we want gods that look like ourselves. So instead, we'll have gods who sort of pop out of the mud. And they'll fight each other because we fight. And they'll have family problems because we have family problems. We make gods in our own image because they're easier to deal with than the true God. And that's what we do. That's what evolution does, is it creates the god just like the Egyptians, just like the Babylonians, just like the Canaanites, creates gods that we can handle. We can deal with the God of evolution. We can deal with what comes of that and see all this change and whatnot and try and take it out of God's hands. Can't deal with a creator God who is all-powerful, all-knowing, and is ever-present, and does everything without any effort. Can't deal with that because, well, we live in a fallen world that is set against him, and that's the veil. So it's really good. A really good thought there, Dave. Oh, any others for help out here? Mm-hmm. And all that language, yeah, against the light being men, desiring the darkness over the light, light coming into the world, and all of that, yeah, was the first thing that he created. Which probably lends a little more credence to the idea that the light itself was probably some sort of illuminating light even originating from God himself, as opposed to my weird thoughts of electromagnetic radiation permeating the universe, which is why we have a background microwave radiation detection that we can do today that people say come from the Big Bang. Say, no, that's just God's creation of the electromagnetic spectrum. Like, that makes sense. Not the other stuff where you have to have alternate universes to make sense, and dark matter and dark energy, but we won't go there today. Those are my own favorite little topics. But that is beautiful. You're right. Yeah. God first started with light, and when we get to the New Testament, light enters the world. That's beautiful. Gosh, it's amazing how this story, all these books put together over the course of thousands of years, tell the same story, and they all flow perfectly together to point to redemption, so that when you get to the New Testament, it's like it's pulled back and you see what the story was. And all these little clues that were always there to point us to God, all of a sudden just become obvious, and we see how God's progression worked through all of it, and it's all one story leading to our Savior, Jesus. Yeah, it's amazing. Amy, did you have a thought or something? Yes, it is. Yeah, it's incredible. The Old Testament is one of those where it's like, that's just mind-boggling. Like, even if you agree with every textual critic out there who wants to say that these things were created late, they were pieced together by not the people who said they write them, they still have to deal with the fact that our current Masoretic text in the year 2020 exactly, except for the most minor little like punctuation points, matches the text we find in Qumran that date back to the 1st century and earlier, and somehow in 2,000 years they didn't change, because that literally has never happened in history in any written document ever. And it's like, what? Like, you do realize something's going on here. The fact of the New Testament, the Old Testament at least had, they had scribes, caretakers of these things. The New Testament were a bunch of slaves and poor people and people without means trying to piece together and keep these letters together. And so we have tons of these copies, and all of them, there are minor differences as people read them and wrote them out and things like that in some of the manuscripts. But when you look at them, the way they all align, like, how could humans do that? If you look across the many thousands and thousands of copies that we have of the early New Testament, dating as far back to the year, I think the earliest one is, P49 is one of the early ones that goes back to the 1st century, was like a first or second copy of the original document, and yet they all match up. Yeah, it's like that can be as incredible as the Qumran stuff, just by the fact that there were so many copies, and yet you put them all together. It's like, okay, no, actually, these all go together, and they fit. Yeah, that is really amazing. That is one of those undeniable type. Like, what do you do with that? I mean, you say no other document has ever been like that. There's been no document with that type of security. What was it? There's far more proof. That's right. There's far more proof about many things, but one of them they go back to is there is more proof of the New Testament being true based on textual evidence than Shakespeare and his writings, based on the copies that were made. More evidence that Jesus lived based on copies than Julius Caesar lived based on literary evidence. I mean, it's crazy. Yeah, it's good stuff.